We're going to pick up from where we left off last week in the Beit Yosef, and that is here on the pages that I handed out, page 8, starting with this, V'im Yibdo Kuti. So the Torah is talking about working the skin to be klaf, and we already learned that the skin has to be Mubad Lishma. First of all, it has to be mubad, it has to be worked. If it's only partially worked, it will not be kosher. And working it means to bring it all the way up to the part where it is worked with afatzim, with the gallnut juice, or as we discussed, that Rabbeinu Tam and the Balei Tosfot hold that if it's worked with lime, that's also considered to be mu'ubad for these halachic purposes. And it has to be worked lishma. It has to be worked for the sake of the mitzvah of writing tefillin. And so now, the Zohar says, "V'im ibdo kuti." If a non-Jew worked the parchment. Kuti is a specific term, which we won't go into, and we'll just say that in certain places in both Talmudic literature and other rabbinic literature, because of the fear of censors, sometimes the girsa, the textual version, was modified so as not to offend the Christian censors, that is, Jews who lived under Christian domination, sometimes to deal with the threat of having their all of their holy books taken away and destroyed, as happened in Paris in the 13th century when all the Talmud were rounded up and burnt. And one of the ways that they would appease the censors is to go through and take away anything that would hint at being disrespectful of non-Jews or Christians in particular. So here, sometimes the original word might have been, let's say, Oved Kochavim Zalot, an idol worshiper, or goy, or nochri. All of these terms also have specific meanings, but sometimes they were changed so that they wouldn't offend the. So I didn't check into this particular issue here about kuti, but we'll just go with what we see. The Beit Yosef himself had different girsa in the tour, right? So the girsa that we have says v'imiti, if a kuti worked it, and you see in the Beit Yosef he says v'imiti goy, if a non-Jew. Okay, so as I said, kuti is a specific term. It referred to specific people, specific time, who were not Jewish, but who had taken upon themselves some mitzvot, and they had a kind of a funny status in Talmudic literature. For our purposes, what's important is that if the ibud was done by a non-Jew, so if a non-Jew did the working of the skin, katav harambam shu pasul. So the Rambam holds that if a non-Jew worked the skin, even if he afil amado Yisrael abed lishmo, it's still going to be pasul, right? So even if the Jew told him that he said to the non-Jew, when you work this skin, I want you to work it for the sake of the mitzvah of tefillin, even if the Jew told him that directly, and presumably even if the non-Jew accepted, nonetheless, the Rambam holds that it's not kosher. it has to be entirely worked by a Jew in order for it to be kosher. Vadoni Avi Zichrono Livracha, and my master, my father of blessed memory, words the Rosh, Shiro, he said it was kosher, he made it kosher. Im Yisrael Omeid Gabav. If a Jew is standing literally on his back, right, or standing by him. V'amarlo abed l'shem tefillin. Right, if the Jew is standing by the non-Jew who's doing the actual work, and the Jew says to the non-Jew, work the skin for the sake of tefillin. So this is important machloket between the Rambam and the Rosh. The Rambam held that non-Jews who work skin, even if a Jew tells them to do it, for the sake of tefillin, the klaf, the resulting klaf is not kosher. And the Rosh held that it is kosher. So let's look into this a bit more closely. Being ibdo goy, right? So if a non-Jew did the ibud, Katav HaRambam bePerek Rishon Filchot Tefillin halacha Yudal Shuhu Pasul Afil Amar Lo Yisrael Abed Lishma. So this is where the Rambam expresses his opinion in Filchot Tefillin from the very first chapter, and he says that if the non-Jew did the ibud, even if the Jew told him to work it for the sake of the tefillin, it's still not kosher. Why? A non-Jew, al da'at atzmo oseh. The non-Jew is doing it, no matter what he says, he's doing it based on his own mindset, based on his own da'at, on his own intelligence and knowledge. Right? So even if the Jew tells him what to do, we see the non-Jew as having a different will. To expand that a little bit, you can understand it this way, that we talk about the Jewish people, and we even, the Gemara says, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'zeh, for certain halachic purposes, that all Jews are connected or mixed in with one another, and non-Jews are not. So if we say to a Jew to work this, like to do something for the sake of a mitzvah, so all Jews are part of the mitzvot. But a non-Jew doesn't have a mitzvah of making tefillin or wearing tefillin. He's not part of that mitzvah. So his mind is not, his mind or his thinking is not going to be pertinent to this, and he won't even, maybe even if he want, I mean, I'm going out on a limb here, but maybe even if he thinks he's doing it for tefillin, but he has no part in that mitzvah. So I think this is how you can understand that that he's going based on his own mindset. However, the Harosh, the Beno Asher, Katav B'Hilchot Sefer Torah, he wrote in Hilchot Sefer Torah, B'Shem HaRav Baruch, in the name of Rav Baruch, who we've seen many times already, who wrote the Sefer HaTruma, Shin HaGoy Ma'abdo, that if the non-Jew is doing the working, Yisrael Omeid Al Gabav, Vit Sia'o Misayeya, and the Jew is standing by him, and he helps him. He actively helps the non-Jew in the processing. Yesh mamash. This has something substantive. In other words, there's halachic substance to the fact that the Jew is both standing there with the non-Jew and is actively participating in the working of the skin. That I'll add in, under these circumstances, the non-Jew will be doing according to the thinking of the Jew, right? So when the Jew is actively engaged with the processing, and he tells the non-Jew that you need to do this for the sake of tefillin, so those things together will make it so that the Rosh understood that under those circumstances, we can say that the non-Jew's mentality will be the same as the Jews. The Katav Od, and he wrote further, V'nagu ha'am kamoshe katav harav Baruch. Right? So he said, in fact, this is the practice of the people, as Rav Baruch wrote, which is what we just mentioned a moment ago, meaning that it's the common practice that that the people who need to get parchment, they get it from non-Jews, and this is how they do it. They go to the non-Jew, and they actively participate in the working of the skin, and they tell the non-Jew, you have to work this for the sake of making tefillin. And he says, he gives a reason why. He says, because in fact, there are no Jewish skin workers in any place, right? Or in all the places, Jewish skin workers. And so that's how the opinion would be decided. So just to add here that this is just an important distinction between the Rambam and the Rosh. The Rambam lived in North Africa, and it would seem that he lived in a place where it wasn't a problem for Jews to work their own skins. However, in Europe, the professions like leather working and skin working, making parchment, these were dominated by the guilds. It was illegal for anybody, Jew or non-Jew, to do those professions unless they had been accepted into the guild. Now, Jews and Jews were simply not accepted into most of these guilds. And so there wasn't an opportunity for Jews to make parchment. So they had to rely on non-Jews by necessity. If they wanted to ever write Sfarim, Tefillin, Mezuzot, they had to get their parchment from non-Jews. So the Rosh was lenient in this regard, and he said that if the Jew will by the non-Jew and tell him that we are making this skin for the sake of the mitzvah of tefillin, that would be sufficient to make it kosher. So it sounds like, according to the Rosh, you need these two factors. You need the Jew to be standing with the non-Jew, telling him what to do, and also the Jew has to be active. He has to help in some way. It could be that the help is very minimal. Maybe he just lifts the skin up and puts it into the lime solution, which is the beginning of the ibud. Maybe it's that simple, but he has to do something active with the non-Jew, and he has to tell the non-Jew that this is what we're doing. And we'll see that there's some seemingly variation on that with other opinions, as we'll see in a moment. V'chein dat bal ha'itur. This is also the opinion of the author of the Itur. Desag goy she'abdenu lishmo. Desagi she'maspik be'goy she'abdenu lishmo. It's enough that a non-Jew will work it lishma. Rabbeinu, so this is the Beit Yosef speaking, saying Rabbeinu, our master, meaning the Tur, lo his Kirsh Israel Yisayeh. When the Torah brought this halacha, he doesn't mention that the Jew has to help, right? When the Torah brings the Rosh, he just says that my father was machshir if the Jew is standing with him, and he says to him to make this for the sake of feeling that the Jew has to stand with him and has to help. Rabbeinu lo hizkir sheYisrael yisayeh. Mashma desvirle de Messiah de Nakata Rav Baruch Afka. So this implies that the Torah held that the Messiah, the aspect that Jew has to help, the Nakata Baruch, that the Sefer Truma mentioned, lav dafka. It's not necessarily a requirement. In other words, the Torah, he's saying the Torah learned the Sefer HaTruma, that's way that what was important is that Yisrael omed al gabav, and the fact that the Sefer HaTruma said that he helps him, that's love. That was not necessarily part of the halacha. The feeling timtzilo dafka ka'amar. So Beit Yosef says, even if you will say that in fact the Sefer Truma said it dafka, had to be that way, that the Jew has to help. Kevan shebal ha'itur hichshir ishmo, below his sheyisayeh ha'Yisrael. Pasak tov. Since the author of the Itur said it's kosher, that the working by the non-Jew for the sake of the mitzvah is kosher itself, and the Itur did not mention that the Jew has to help. So you could say that even if the Itur understood that the Sefer Truma said that you have to help, that the Jew has, that the Baal HaItur did not say you have to help. So maybe the Torah ultimately holds like the Baal HaItur, and that's why he doesn't mention that the Jew has to help. יותר נראה לומר שסמך על מה שכתב בהלכות ספר תורה. Beit Yosef says, but it seems more likely that the Torah relied on what he wrote in Hilchot Sefer Torah, in Yeridea, Siman Reish Ayin Aleph, Divrei HaRav Baruch, that he's Kirsh Yisrael Messiah. It's more likely that the Torah does in fact hold that the Jew has to help. And he didn't mention it here because he expounded upon this and expanded upon it or in Hilchot Sefer Torah and Yeridea, which we'll look at in a moment. And over there, he brings Rav Baruch, the Sefer Truma, and he mentions this idea of Yisrael Messiah, that the Jew has to help. So let's take a moment and look at the tour over there. So we're looking in the tour Yeridea Siman Reish Ayin Aleph, where the tour covers a number of the issues that we've already covered here in Siman Lamed Bet in Orach Chaim, where he talks about where he's also going to be talking about the Dio, etc. So here he actually begins the Siman by talking about this issue of the skin. And let's read through and we'll see how he words this here, how the Torah understood this here. Ein kotvin se Torah tefillin mezuzot al or behema b'chayat tamea. Right, so one does not write STaM on the skin of an animal, either a domesticated animal or a wild animal that's tame, that is not kosher, or dog, and one does not write these things on the skin of a fish, a fil hatahor, even the fish, even the kind of fish that's kosher. Ela al behima b'chayav al patol. Right? You can only write it on the skin of a behima, a chayav, or an oaf, animal domesticated or wild, or fowl that are tahor, that the Torah says you are allowed to eat. Afilu or nevelo to trefot shenachim. And even on the skin of ones that were not slaughtered kosher, allowed to have a certain kind of blemish that would render them not kosher. But since the type of animal itself is kosher, you're allowed to use its skin. Tzarich sheyu ha'orot mu'badin l'shem sefer Torah. And the skins have to be worked for the sake of Sefer Torah. So just to point out, even though he started off by talking about Sefer Torah, but ultimately he's here on Hilchot Sefer Torah, so he's going to focus on the ibud of Sefer Torah. Or you could say that, as we learn elsewhere in the Beit Seif, that if you work the skin, the Beit Yosef pointed out that if you work the skin, the Shem Sefer Torah, you could also write on it tefillin or mezuzot. So it's another reason why he would focus on Sefer Torah. Aval tikun haklaf v'sirtut tzarich sheyeh lishma. Right, the fixing of the klaf, and I think right here he means the finishing, and he's going to break this down because he's going to talk in a moment about the ibud. And I think what he means is right after you do the basic ibud and you take it out, you have to do all kinds of things to it still to make it suitable for writing. So that's the tikkun haklaf, the sirtuto, and the scoring. Those things do not have to be done lishma. They don't have to be the sake of the mitzvah of Sefer Torah. V'arav Rabbeinu Baruch b'Sefer Truma mistapek in tzarich sheyotzi b'sfatav shema'abdo lishma o im sagi b'machshava shemechashev kach b'riba. He's unsure if one has to declare, if he has to take it out from this, he has to declare orally that he's making he's doing the ibud for the mitzvah, or if it's sufficient just to think it. This is what he had been thinking in his heart. Maybe it's enough even if he doesn't say it out loud. The Katav Donavi Zal, right? So my father, he wrote, Hilkach Tov Shiotzi V'Sfatav. So therefore it's good that he should say it out loud. V'yomar b'tfilat ha'ibud ki she'nisimo l'toch hasid. You should say at the beginning of the working process, and this is where we see what the beginning of the working process is. Ki she'nisimo l'toch hasid. When he places it into the line, that's considered to be the beginning of the ibud per se, and he should declare, "Orot elu ani ma'abed l'kedushat Sefer Torah." You should say out loud that I work these skins for the holiness of the Sefer Torah. V'tu lo tzarich, and then he doesn't need to say it anymore. Once you say it at the beginning, you don't have to say it at each part of the process, because first it's going to soak, and then after a few days he'll take it out and he'll scrape off the hair, and then it's going to be stretched, and then he has to let it dry out a little bit, and he has to scrape it some more, and he has to scrape off the back, right? So there's all these parts of the processing. He doesn't declare for every time he does something to the skin that he's making a b'shem Sefer Torah. So now he had made this declaration at the beginning of the process. Katava Rambam, similar up to the part that we saw in Orach Chaim, in Hilchot Tefillin. Katava Rambam, Ima nachrim abdo, pasul, afil omer lo Yisrael, abedo rot elu l'shem sefer Torah. So Rambam says, if the non-Jew does the working of the skin, it's pasul, even if the Jew says to him, work these skins for the sake of making a Torah. V'harav Rabbeinu Baruch, the Sefer Truma, katav she'ima abdo v'she'ina abdo, that if the non-Jew does the ibud, Yisrael made al gabav, Messiah, right? And if the non-Jew does the ibud and the Jew stands on him, stands by him, and helps him, share, then it's mutar. Then the skin, that this is kosher. V'chein katav ba ha'itur, and similarly, this is what the author of the Itur wrote. V'sagi benachri shim abdam nishma. It's sufficient with a non-Jew who has worked them for the sake of the mitzvah. V'chein hu maskanat adami avi harosh sal. This is also the conclusion of my rosh. So what do we see? That over here, the Tur expands a little bit more on what he said in Hilchot Tefillin, because he goes out of his way to mention by name. He's quoting the Sefer Truma, and that the Sefer Truma is the one who says that the Jew both has to be next to the non-Jew and to help him and say to the non-Jew that you need to make this lishma. And he brings the Baal Itur. It seems like he's bringing the Baal Itur, who doesn't mention this idea of helping. He's bringing him to support the Sefer HaTruma. And the Beit Yosef will explain that a little bit more in a moment, back in the Orach Chaim. This is also what Rav Natnai wrote. Rav Natnai, of course, is one of the Gaonim, and he said, if it is possible for the Jew to do the ibud lishma, mitzvah min hamurchak. That's the choice way to do the mitzvah. Love, and if it's not possible for the Jew to do the ibud, yelech l'nachri, he should go to the non-Jew. Yomar lo, klaf sefer Torah mitzarich. He says to the non-Jew, I need klaf to write sefer Torah for a sefer Torah. Uchishim abdam l'shem sefer Torah yisayeh mo Yisrael ma'at. Right, so Rav Nai says this idea also that when the non-Jew is working them for the sake of the Sefer Torah, that the Jew should help him a little bit. And in this fashion, this is considered to be ibud for the sake of the mitzvah. Now, the Torah now brings an interesting tshuva that relates to this, and we're going to look at it because it's going to be alluded to also in the Beit Yosef back in Hilchot Tefillin. It's a tshuva gaon. There's a tshuva from one of the gaonim, Linyan ibud lishma, that deals with this question of ibud lishma, and it says Rabbanan detarte mitifta, the rabbis of two yeshivas. So this is at a time when the main yeshivas were still in Bavel, and at that time, if I remember correctly, the two main yeshivas were in Sura and Pumbedita. So when it says Rabbanan detarte mitifta, means the rabbis, the Rosh Yeshiva of both agreed, Svir lahu, they held, the kosher lo lishma pasuli growth bo b'tzibur, that any time a Sefer Torah was written on parchment that was not made lishma, it's pasul. It's not good to read on it. It's halachically not acceptable to read on that sefer in public. However, Mori Rav Moshe Gaon, however, my master, Rav Moshe Gaon, who was also one of the Gaonim, Avi Palik, he was cholek, he disagreed. Yamar, mitzvah min hamuchar leme'abad lishma. So he said it's the best way to do the mitzvah, to do the ibud lishma, aval mitorat sefer shekorim lo nafik. But if you didn't do the ibud lishma, it does not leave the din of being called a sefer that you can read it, that you can read from. אבל מתורת ספר שקוראים לא נפיץ. זה לא יצא מדין ספר שקוראים בו בציבור. So Moshe Gaon held that b'diavad, if you have a Sefer Torah that was written on parchment that was not Shema, it's still kosher to read from that Torah in public. B'ilana u'rabanan dikduka b'hamilta lidchu yadu Rav Moshe Gaon. So this literally means in Hebrew, v'yesh lanu u'rabanim דקדוק בהדבר הזה, לדחות דברי, לדחות את זה שאמר רב משה גאון. Meaning, right, we and the rabbis have a dikduk, a diuk, right? In other words, we have a way of understanding the sources in a particular way that, you know, it's with the dayek, we're being very careful on how we understand those sources that would push away the words of Rav Moshe Gaon. In other words, they're saying the way we learn the Gemara and the way we understand this halacha is in fact not Moshe Gaon. Meaning what? That if you have a Sefer Torah that's not written on klaf that was mubad lishma, you can't read from it in public. Umihu, atem she'en bimkomchem, right? So this is continuing the person who wrote the tshuva. He says, however, you, that you do not have in your place shosek vilim velo dak, you don't have somebody who can make kvil or dak, pirush klaf. Dak is a word that means klaf in Arabic. Im yesh bimkomchem sefer Torah kuhugan hishamru v'kiru bo b'tzibur. Right, so if you have in your place a proper sefer Torah, so then you should share and read from that in public. In other words, read for that in shul. But if you don't, in other words, if you only have a sefer Torah that was written on parchment, that was worked by a non-Jew, al tashbitu kriyat Torah b'tzibur. You should not stop reading the Torah in public. Because the pasuk says, when it is time to do for the Lord, heferu toratecha, you should void your Torah. It's a famous drasha, which I won't look into right now to explain. It's a drasha. It's not the pshat of the pasuk. This is the basis also for Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who said that even though the halacha is that you are not allowed to write down divrei Torah, but if it's time to do something for the Lord, then you have to sometimes void your tongue. Welcome, Linda.
Hi, am I the only one again?
Yes, and I'm doing my monologue, but now you get to join me.
Okay. Can I listen in on the monologue for a little while then?
Yeah, well, yes.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what we're doing.
Yep.
And of course, you can go back and listen to the beginning of the shiur.
Yes, I do that later. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, we're examining the question of whether or not parchment that was worked by a non-Jew could be kosher or not. So the machloket that is brought down by the Tur in Hilchot Tefillin is that the Rambam holds it's not, even if a Jew is standing with the non-Jew, telling him to make this lishma, telling him to make this parchment for the sake of writing tefillin or sefer Torah or mezuzah, it's not kosher. And the Tur's father, the Rosh, disagreed and said that no, if the Jew is standing there with him and tells him to work at lishma, and he also helps him a little bit, then it's kosher. So you'll see earlier in the discussion that Beit Yosef discusses whether or not the Jew has to help him or doesn't have to help him, and he says the Tur doesn't mention this idea that he has to help him, so it's not clear if the Tur thinks that he needs to help or not. But then the Beit Yosef says it would seem that the Tur does tell us all of the details in Hilchot Tefillin because he relied on what he said in Hilchot Sefer Torah. And right now, what we're looking at is the Tur in Hilchot Sefer Torah in Yoredea. That's what's on the screen. And we're in the middle of what the Tur brought down, where he brings down again the opinion of Rambam and the opinion of the Rosh. And here he expands on it a little bit, and he brings the Mekorot that seem to indicate that the Jew needs to help. And now in addition, he's brought the opinion of Rav Nachshunai Gaon. Rav Nachshunai was one of the Gaonim who says this same thing, that you can have the skin worked by a non-Jew, and the Jew should be there with him helping. And now he also brings this interesting tshuva that was from the time of the Gaonim. It deals with this question. And it says that even though, now this is a quick summary, but even though the rabbis, the Shei Yeshiva in both of the big yeshivas in Bavel held that if the skin was not made lishma, then it's pasul to read a Sefer Torah that was written on that in shul. And that seemingly we'll see, it includes the idea that if the non-Jew was the one who worked it. However, he says there is an opinion, whoever wrote this tshuva, it's not clear who wrote the tshuva, but he says, my teacher of Moshe Gaon, Havi Palik, my teacher of Moshe Gaon disagreed. And he said, even though it's the way to do the mitzvah is to write the Sefer Torah on parchment that was mishma, but if it was not, if you have a Sefer Torah that was written on parchment that was not made lishma, it doesn't take it out of the halacha category of a sefer that you can read in public. And he goes on to say, right, that I am the are we and these rabbis, we have a particular way of understanding this thing that would push away the words of Rav Moshe Gaon. In other words, we have good solid ground to say that Rav Moshe Gaon here is wrong, that even the diavad, you're not allowed to read from a Sefer Torah that was written on parchment that was not made lishma, but the person writes the tshuva, says, he says, but you, nonetheless, the people in your place, if you don't have somebody who can make the gvil or the parchment, dak is the word, I believe it must have been Arabic. If you don't have somebody who can make it for you, if you have a proper Sefer Torah in your place, meaning that it was written on parchment that was made lishma, then you should take care and read from that in shul. And if you don't have such a Sefer Torah, you only have a Sefer Torah that's written on parchment that was not made lishma, al tashbitu kriyata Torah b'tzibur. You should not stop from doing the Torah reading in shul. That's
I
what I
can't, it doesn't seem to be screen sharing with me. I don't know why. I've got to.
Oh, wait a second. No? You don't see.
Now I do. Okay. Now I have it.
Okay.
Sorry. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
And I was just explaining this is a drush that Chazal used in other instances to say that when exceptional circumstances that warrant doing something for the sake of Hashem, then sometimes you need to void the regular halacha, and that's what the person who wrote the tshuva was saying here. That here, in other words, it's going to be better. Ela asu sefer Torah min adak, af al pi she'ena me'ubad lishma. He says, if that's the case, then you should make the sefer Torah from this klaf, even though it was not mishma. Shemori Rav Moshe kedaihu lismoch alav b'shat hadchak. My teacher, Rav Moshe Gaon, he is worthy of being relied upon under extreme circumstances, under pressing circumstances. So the point of this tshuva is to say that this idea that you have to write the Sefer Torah on parchment that was written lishma, everybody holds that that's the best way to do it. There is a singular opinion of Moshe Gaon who held that de facto, b'diavad, that it's okay if you didn't. And the point of the tshuva is to say that if you're in a bind and you have no other choice but to have a Sefer Torah that was written on this parchment that was not meshma, then that's what you should do, because it's better to do that and keep up Kriyat Torah than to abandon Kriyat Torah altogether. The kol came al derech shamar et lasot Hashem efiru Toratecha. And all the more so, based on this idea, when you have an opportunity to do something, or you need to do something for the sake of Hashem, like keeping up reading the Torah every week in shul, then heferu Toratecha, then you void the regular halacha. About now this is where it also gets interesting. I'm reading is this because again the Beit Yosef is going to refer to this in Hilchot Tefillin, but he tells us that it's talked about here. להחזיר יריות הדק לידי ולהעביר עליה הסיד לשמה, הרי יצאתם ידי עיבוד לשמה. He says something very interesting. He says, if you have the capability to take these sheets of parchment that were not made lishma, and you can put them back on the stretcher, and then you can go over them again with lime, And when you go over them again with lime, you say, I'm putting this on now for lishma, right? For the sake of making it Torah. Then you in fact have fulfilled ibud lishma. So you can take skins that in fact were already me'ubad, that were already worked. And he says it's possible to return them to an early state by putting them back on the strap, going over them again with lime. And when you go over them again with lime, you say, I am working them for the sake of Torah. Kitvubo. And if you don't have the possibility of doing that, then nonetheless write on them. Right? Even though they weren't work lishma, and you can still read that Torah in public. So it's altogether a very interesting thing. Right? It's pointing to some of the realities of the time and place. And you'll hear for earlier in this year where I talked about the difference between North Africa and Europe. And this is talking about Babylonia back in, I'm guessing around the 7th or 8th century, maybe the 9th century. The other to point out here, and this is something to keep in mind, and it's something that will come up maybe much later in our studies when we study Hilchot Sefer Torah in greater depth. You need to understand that there are two aspects to the mitzvah of Sefer Torah as we comprehend it. There's a mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah, and that's a mitzvah min HaTorah. There's a mitzvah to read from a Sefer Torah in public, but that's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. So there's certain, we'll see that in discussions in Rishonim about aspects of kashrut of a Sefer Torah, we're sometimes mekil about how kosher or not kosher a Sefer Torah can be and still be able to read from it. It doesn't mean that that's a kosher Sefer Torah, right? So in other words, his whole argument here is, of course you should write a Sefer Torah on klaf that was made lishma. Of course you should do that. But if you can't, you should still read from it. If you have a Sefer Torah that was written on klaf that was not made lishma, you should still read from it. Because you could argue that the mitzvah of reading from it, the mitzvah of reading Torah, which is d'Rabbanan, is not necessarily dependent on reading from a Torah for which you would have fulfilled the mitzvah of writing a Torah for. That's a little but not necessarily well phrased. So just that out now. We'll get into that much later. I just want to get a bit more in the tour, and then we'll finish off by looking at the Beit Yosef. He says, "It's a real shame ubad b'afatzim." You do the working; it has to be worked with afatzim, right? With the garment solution of ubad b'afatzim. If it's not worked with gall, avi diftera. Right? We saw this earlier, I believe. Right? The Gemara calls skin that was not finished, it didn't go through a processing with gall, it's called diftera, pasul. Right? It's not good, it's not kosher for writing sfarim, tefillin, and mezuzot. Mihu, nonetheless, haya omer Rabbeinu Tam, ibud seed shelanu, chashuv ki ibud afatzim. Rabbeinu Tam held that the working that we do with lime is considered to be just like the working with gall. Then it could be written on the Sefer Torah, or the Mezuzah could be written on the gvil or the klaf or the duksustus Actually, here he's talking specifically about the Sefer Torah, that the Sefer Torah could be written on any of these things, klaf, vil, or duchsustus. But Rambam psala al duchsustus. The Rambam held that the Torah that's written on duchsustus is pasul. Yadoni avi harosh sal lo katavke. And my father, the Rosh, did not write that. In other words, he didn't agree. So then he goes into this discussion about exactly what Gvil is. And we actually looked at this in an earlier shiur. So I'm going to go back to where we were in the Beit Yosef. And this is where we were. So I'll pick up here. So this is where the Beit Yosef is saying that the Tur over here in Hilchot Tefillin did not mention that the Jew needs to help in the Ibud, but it would be enough for the Jew to say to the non-Jew to do the Ibud Lishma. And the Beit Yosef entertains the idea that maybe the Tur doesn't hold that the Jew has to help. But then he says, Yotir nireh l'mashe samach l'mashe katav b'ilchot Sefer Torah. He says, but actually, it seems more likely that the Tur didn't hold din here, and he relied on what he wrote in Hilchot Sefer Torah, which we just looked at, where over there he wrote the words of Rabbeinu Baruch, Yizkir Yisrael Messiah. That's where he mentioned that the Jew needs the Gam Katav HaTur Sham. The Torah also wrote there, B'Shem Rav Nachunai, U'Kishmabdam Hashem Sefer Torah Yisayeh Momat. Over there he brought the opinion of Rav Nachunai, who said that when you work them with the non-Jew for the sake of writing a Torah, that the Jew should help him a little bit. Pishagam Sham Katav. So even though over there he also wrote the opinion of the author of the Itur, who did not say specifically that the Jew needs to help. Mashma de kaharav baruch l'rav nachunai naktina. Nonetheless, it's implied that we hold like Rav Baruch, like the Sefer Truma and Rav Trunai. V'lo hevi divrei Baal HaYitur ela fuke meharamba to pasal ubud goy. So if that's true, why did he bring the opinion of the Itur, who does not mention this specific that the Jew needs to help? He says it could be he just brings the Itur as support for the idea that we do not hold like the Rambam, because the Rambam says if the goy did the ibud, it's altogether pasul, and the Itur disagrees with that. And then the Beit Yosef says a little bit more of a chidush. He says, it's possible that the author of the Itur himself also holds that the Jew needs to help him, even though it's not actually written in his words. And this is also how it's written in the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol. It's a Shitena wrote be'ibud lishman, o yisayel legoy b'shat ibud lishman. Right, when the Smag discusses this issue of doing the ibud lishma, he says Jew needs to put the skins in to be worked lishma, or that he has to help the non-Jew at the time that he's ibud to help him to do it lishma. Etc. So this is the conclusion that we do hold that a non-Jew can do the working, provided that the Jew is with him at the time of the beginning of the working, which the Tur defined over in Hilchot Sefer Torah as being the time that you take the skin and put it into the line as a depilatory. And at that time, the Jew has to help him somehow, even a little, probably maybe the easiest thing is to help him either lift up the skin and put it in, or to lower the skin in. And he has to say, then he has to declare, and it's preferable that he declares out loud that I'm working this parchment for the sake of the mitzvah of writing Sefer Torah or Tefillin or Mezuzah. So I'm going to finish off with this last little bit here. And this is sectioned off because it doesn't refer specifically to something that the Tur said, but the Beit Yosef brought it at this juncture. And he says, Katuv ba'agot mayim on perek rishon li'ilchot tefillin. וכשמסמנים הנקבים במרצע כאין אותיות. When we mark with holes that are made by an awl, right? Things that look like these holes that will be in the shape of letters. אף על פי שהרבה נקל לגוי לזייף שייתן את הנקובים על שאינם נקובים, וינקוב במרצע דרך הנקבים כמו שעשה הישראל, even though it would be very easy for the Jew who's working, right? I'm adding it, who's working your parchment, for him to take one piece of skin and put it that you marked with these holes, and put it on top of another piece of skin that he prefer to give you. And when you're not looking, he could take an awl and poke through your holes and make the same pattern of holes on another skin. Even though that would be very easy for him to do. And then presumably you would know which is which, right? He could substitute the one that he marked for the one that you gave him. Nonetheless, we're not worried for this kind of falsification. Demirtat goy, because the non-Jew will be afraid. Pen yakir ha-Yisrael b'tviyut ayin, lest the Jew would be able to recognize upon close examination shenatan b'simanim, right? That you'd be able to, upon close examination, that the way that the non-Jew put in the simanim. So I did that more or less as almost a straight translation, but what it's pointing to is that what we understood from the previous part is that it was common for Jews to bring their skins to the non-Jews to work for them. It would be there at the beginning to help them do the ibud, so that they could make it lishma. And then this non-Jew, right, who's working a lot of skins, so he has whole piles of skins that don't belong to the Jew. So how does the Jew make sure that he's going to get, when it's finished, right, it's going to look very different. So how does he know it's his? He's going to mark it with little otiyot, right? He'll put holes in the shape of letters, and that's how he's going to recognize his after the whole process is done. So the Hagot Maimonides brings up this possibility, what if the non-Jew decides he's going to take your skin and substitute it for another skin, and he'll make sure you don't know, because he'll just take an awl and he'll poke through your holes and make holes in the other skin that he wants to give you instead. So the Hagot Maimonides says we're not really worried he's going to do that, because he's going to be afraid that nonetheless you're going to be able to tell the difference between the holes that you made and the holes that the non made. But it's an interesting thing, and it just reflects the kinds of challenges that they lived with at the time. And then this last part here, skin that had been worked not lishma. If there is a way of fixing it to go back and rework it lishma, Katav Rabbeinu Bilchot Sefer Torah. So Rabbeinu B'Tur wrote this in Bilchot Sefer Torah, and we saw that. We said that in Prince, yes, if you can, if you haven't, right? If you haven't already, he didn't say this. If you haven't started, but obviously that's the case. If you have the skins that will work not lishma, if you could back and put them on a stretcher and go over them again with lime lishma, then you can make them lishma after the original ibud. So this is a place to stop.